Welcome to the afternoon sessions of our Climate Action Conference in collaboration with Friends of the Earth. My name is Emma Jones and I'm part of the Cities team here at Ashton. And I'm just going to be chairing this session, which is covering buildings. So each of the sessions has a similar format where you have a bit of an introduction to the topic, and then we have an external guest speaker talking through their case study in some detail, and then one of my colleagues talking through some of the other case studies produced on this topic. So just to introduce the buildings session. So buildings are a major source of carbon emissions in the UK. Around 17% of our carbon emissions come from energy used in buildings, both housing and non-domestic, and that primarily results from burning fossil fuels for heating. And buildings are also responsible for 59% of the UK's electricity consumption, and that's mostly appliances and lighting in homes, and things like cooling and ICT equipment in non-residential buildings. You've also got considerable amounts of carbon emissions coming from the construction of new buildings. So what can be done to cut carbon in this sector? Well, emissions can be reduced through making buildings as efficient as possible. So they need to use the minimum amount of energy and then supplying this energy from renewable sources. And local authorities have direct control over a substantial portion of the UK's buildings, and that's in terms of their own estate. So that's their offices, their leisure centres, and in some cases their schools. Also their own housing stock, where this is still under their control, and over the building of new homes, particularly where these are their own stock, but also other new development that's built through planning regulations. So while there are national minimum standards for new homes, homes built to those standards are still some way off being zero carbon, and there's scope to require homes to be much more efficient. We've already heard in the fuel poverty session earlier how councils are improving the energy efficiency of existing residential buildings. So in this session, we're going to hear from one council that's making sure that new homes built on its own land are built to the highest possible energy efficiency standards. And before I hand over to our speaker, just to say, we'll have a session at the end of this slot for questions. So as we go through the presentations, please put any questions you've got into the Q&A function. You'll see a button for that at the bottom of your screen. Also, feel free to share things in the chat. So if you've got comments, if you've got resources you want to share, if you're just joining us now and would like to introduce yourself, please do add your comments into the chat. And for anyone who's on social media, although I think Twitter might be down at the moment, but if Twitter's working again, we're sharing resources on Twitter with the hashtag Council Climate Action. So I'm delighted to welcome our speaker for this session, Councillor Denise Crackhill, Executive Member for Housing from City of York Council, to tell us all about what they've been doing. Over to you, Denise.
Thank you very much. So I shall now attempt to share my screen, which I always find slightly challenging. Let's see if that works. That looks right, and then there we are. Gosh, that was a good start. So thank you for inviting me to share this. For us in York, getting to the point where construction has actually started this month on our first certified passive house and zero carbon homes has been an exciting journey so far. York has a very challenging housing market with high prices and a pressing need for more affordable homes. There's also a shortage of available and affordable land, whilst at the same time York declared a climate emergency in 2019 and an ambition to reach zero carbon by 2030. So although we're generally a prosperous city, we also have a substantial low-wage economy, making it even more challenging for many by the current cost of living crisis and rising energy bills. So with that in background in mind, our approach to delivering our programme of 600 new homes has been, as you see on the screen, we primarily are using council-owned land. We're focused both on delivering social value through high quality developments that support health and well-being and inclusive communities, and on reducing carbon emissions, energy use and fuel bills. Our funding model is to use market sales to help cross-fund development, whilst also maximising grant funding and other sources. We have an in-house development team, but externally procured consultants, including architectural, engineering, public engagement and cost management, so a really great team. And we have strong public engagement as a key element of the programme, supported by a design manual that gives us an overall mandate for the project. So the design manual, you see the sort of elements of it set out here. It sets out our ambitions from the beginning through seeing each site as a new zero carbon community rather than just a housing development. We've emphasised high quality outdoor spaces, reduce car dependency, including excellent provision for cycling and walking, creating physical connections with existing neighbourhoods, creating play streets and safe places for socialising and community activities. Our developments are inclusive with high levels of affordable housing and high levels of accessibility standards, supporting residents to live independently for as long as possible. We decided to build directly rather than sell off our sites because we believe we can have a greater social and environmental impact by doing that. So as I said, on this slide, you can see some of the public engagement, which is key, getting to know the existing neighbourhood, what local facilities it already has, and what the needs are that the new development might contribute to, such as shops or a new community centre, etc. And this really involved getting local residents stuck into helping with the design process. You can see the blocks of wood and little model trees, a lot of that went on. And it also led to residents better understanding the energy efficiency ambitions and the advantages of the passive house, and challenging them to come up with their own proposals to reduce carbon emissions worked really well in that context. Our first project in the programme, which is almost complete and occupied, was Lowfield Green. That isn't zero carbon, but it is a significant step forwards. It's predominantly EPC A-rated homes with significantly enhanced insulation levels and the use of solar PV. And the site also supports self-build and a community build initiative. The next two slides are just some images of Lowfield Green with the residents in situ. Bungalows, passive house purists will see the B word there, bungalows, but they are very, very popular with residents. And that residents are very happy to be in their new homes. As you can see, this slide just references the importance of accessibility and adaptability in the new homes that we're building. But also I think emphasises that whilst technical aspects are important, people are central, and we really have to get people on site and involved in order to scale up on all of this. All our forthcoming projects will achieve certified passive house status and be net zero carbon in operation. On an annual basis, all energy demand will be met on site. Passive house significantly reduces energy demand, and the use of solar PV and air source heat pumps will be sufficient to meet energy needs. Energy demand assumptions include both regulated heating and lighting and unregulated energy demand, so phone charging, iPods, home computers. This image shows you our first passive house site, Duncan Barracks. It provides 34 homes set around a public green space. The terrace to the right fronts onto a car-free street. Car parking spaces are around 0.5 spaces per home, and the site creates a new pedestrian and cycle connection between an existing neighbourhood and the local school and the shops. This is Burnholme, our second site with similar credentials to Duncan Barracks, but with 83 new homes. This development provides more cycle parking spaces than it has bedrooms, and supporting sustainable transport choices. Intergenerational homes are also provided, including that one in the foreground with the balcony, which support 2 generations of the same family to live with independence, but support where needed. again, helping people to stay longer in their homes. 60% of these homes on these 2 sites will be affordable following some additional Homes England grant that we've secured. This is the 3rd site, with Ordnance Lane, which will have 85 new Passive House homes, plus internal and external community spaces. It'll have 2 commercial units and 6 live workspaces as well. The design of the homes considers home working, and the live workspaces allow people to operate more substantial and messy businesses from close to home, again reducing the need to travel and supporting that wider zero carbon agenda. The proposal incorporates the retention and retrofit of one of the historic buildings, and that retrofit aims to achieve a very high level of thermal performance and will support some of the business type units. And that construction will begin in 2023. So the key challenges that we've had, you can see construction costs and inflation, everyone's probably aware of that. Passive House does cost more, but in the York housing market, we are very optimistic that house prices, the market sale part of the model, will meet those cost rises. A shortage of construction experience in the area, in this area of building. We believe we've overcome that. We have the same building contractor for the first 2 sites and possibly also for the 3rd. Challenging the norm in the wider aspects of the site, the car parking numbers and play streets, can be a little bit of a challenge, but again, we're progressing with that. And our projects do rely on those strong market sales. So what have we achieved so far? Obviously, we're aiming to very significantly reduce carbon emissions. The programme principles are to achieve zero carbon in use across the year, but we've also considered embodied carbon throughout the design process. This has resulted in design decisions such as the use of timber frame construction instead of block and brick, and using reduced cement concrete and recycled newspaper insulation for the walls. And we're also seeking to source materials locally where possible. The result is that our housing programme will save approximately 1,000 tonnes of CO2 per year, or as this slide shows it, the equivalent to driving where's this? I'm going to get this mixed up now. Of driving a fossil fuel vehicle 7 million miles around the world 300 times. So that's just another way of putting it. And of course, the approach brings major benefits to residents with anticipated energy bill savings of over 75%, as well as the major benefits for our future energy security and demand reduction. We're aiming to set the standards and demonstrate what can be done by this housing programme, combining social value and carbon reduction. So just getting towards the last slides, developing local skills and supply chains is obviously also a priority. Our projects are looking to improve skills and knowledge in the local design and construction industry. We started by undertaking a skills survey to identify gaps in skills and knowledge. We secured local government association funding to support the delivery of sustainable design and construction courses, and these were attended by our repairs teams, by local contractors, teachers from our local college, etc. And we worked in partnership with the local contractor, which is this image here, to bring a passive house pod to one of our sites, and that's involved local school children, councillors and local builders visiting to see what a passive house actually looks like. Our contracts for our first 2 sites commit the contractor to the creation of 30 jobs, 22 work placements, training events targeted at 14 to 19-year-olds, and on-site training for existing staff, all with that focus on green skills. And they will work with our local training providers and with the local construction industry and SMEs helping to create training content. And that will also help to support the retrofit work that we are trying to do. That sort of cross feeds into that. So finally, again, as I said, our aim is not only to build sustainable homes, but to inspire others. And we have been getting quite a bit of attention for that. So that's obviously today. That was the United Nations Centres of Excellence who have become part of that network. And that was an article in The Guardian a little while ago. I'm not sure calling it Everest is the best thing. I think we're managing to scale it. But that's the end of my presentation. I'm sorry if I've gone over. Not sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Denise. That's really interesting, and what a very attractive looking development. You can see so much going on in there as well. You can see, I think I can see aspects of SUD, so things to reduce surface water flooding as well. There's lots of things going on there. So we're going to come to questions after our next presentation. So do please put any questions you've got in the Q&A function, and we'll come to those in the next sort of 7 to 10 minutes. But before we do that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Cara, who's going to talk you through some of the other case studies that we've produced in this theme.
Thank you very much, Emma. So for those who didn't hear me this morning, I'm Cara Jenkinson from the Cities team at Ashton, and I'm going to be talking about some of the other case studies within the buildings theme. So if I can have the next slide, please, Vicky. In terms of the what we're going to cover in the case studies, so we've already heard about your case study with buildings being built on council land to be extremely energy efficient. But we're also going to look at a case study that looks at privately built new homes and the standards around those. I'm going to talk about another study about how CIL, community infrastructure levy, is being used, and also look at Greater Manchester, where they have a big focus on skills and training, which is something that Denise just touched on there. Next slide, thank you. So we're going to start off with Reading. So basically, national building regulations don't currently require new homes to be zero carbon, unfortunately, although that is coming down the line with the Future Home Standard. But councils can set their own local planning requirements that demand the standards, although very few have done so to date. Reading Council is a council that has done this. And in their 2019 local plan, they require that all new residential developments of 10 or more new homes are built to zero carbon standards if possible. And the local plan states that if the developer believes that the zero standard can't be met, the development must deliver 35% or a greater reduction in carbon emissions compared to minimum UK standards. And they must pay a £1,800 per tonne offset, that's per tonne of carbon emissions. And offsetting relates directly to energy efficiency or renewable energy contributions in the local area. So next slide, please. So two factors were critical to enabling this policy. So really strong political buy-in. So lead members, even before the climate emergency was declared, had said that they wanted to reach the highest sustainability standards. And then in terms of the viability assessment, which of course always comes back when looking at this, the council's viability consultant attended the local plan examination, and they provided a note for the planning inspector on how assessment took zero carbon into account. So lessons for other councils. In fact, resistance from developers wasn't that great, and that you might find that it's less than you're anticipating. And that possibly was helped by the fact that the council produced a sustainable design and construction supplementary planning document, which really helped developers see how the standards could be met. Thank you, Vicky. So in terms of the resources, the policy does create extra work, and the council doesn't have the resources to do that work. So you know, there's knowledge of SAP assessment in the building control department, but they're very busy, so they can't do it. And their sustainability team doesn't have that expert knowledge. So the council uses consultants, Element Energy, to review the submitted information for major schemes, and the cost for that is charged to the developer. So moving on to the next case study, and so this is looking at using community infrastructure levy to fund climate action. So it's a a great example of how a council can actually raise money to do more on climate action. So for those of you that aren't aware, community infrastructure levy is a planning charge enforced on councils, by councils rather, on some new housing or home expansions that raises money for infrastructure development, funding improvements like new schools, public transport and parks. And what South Gloucestershire Council is doing is they're using their SIL to fund the local authority's climate emergency infrastructure budget. And that was approved, the decision to do that, in February 2020, and it's going to amount to 1.5 million a year to at least 2024. And what they're going to use that money for is going to be split equally across 3 focus areas: green schools, green transport and green communities. And the money raised will be topped up from the UK government's New Homes bonus. So next slide, just before we move on to the next slide, I've shown there a few of the things that are going to be used there. So for example, the green transport, providing EV charging points for residents that might not be served by the commercial operators, tree planting, back to the theme that we had earlier this morning, and a council-owned tree nursery, and then match funding on schools, the public sector decarbonisation scheme. So in terms of lessons for other councils, so there's some nuance around using the SIL for revenue versus capital funding. And there were several discussions with the finance team at the council. But in fact, the SIL regulations do allow for funds to be spent on green infrastructure as a revenue cost. But you do need to understand those levy regulations to overcome any misunderstandings. And what can really help bringing the finance team on board is co-benefits, showing how taking action on climate can really address some of the council's other objectives. Another lesson just if you could go back, thank you. Another lesson was that many councils may be underestimating the potential income from SIL, in that the UK government clearly has high numbers of new homes that they want to build, and in fact levy receipts may actually be greater than you think they will be. And then finally, an opportunity to link with parish and town councils. So those councils can receive 15 or 25% of SIL income from their areas if they've adopted a neighbourhood development plan. And so there's the potential to work with those tiers of councils to deliver more climate action. So on to the next case study. So this is around Manchester's work. So Greater Manchester Combined Authority published a smart energy plan in 2019. And the plan included a vision for Greater Manchester as a global leader on smart energy, and there was a big emphasis on energy efficient homes. But the plan noted that a major obstacle for delivering that was the shortage of suitably skilled labour. So GMCA estimates that retrofitting even 20% of Greater Manchester's homes could create economic activity worth between 3 billion and 5.4 billion. It's a huge amount and could create 55,000 jobs. So last year in 2021, they partnered with the Low Carbon Academy, which is part of the Northwest Skills Academy, and incidentally a finalist for the one of the 2022 Ashton Awards. And the Low Carbon Academy is aiming to train 1,140 people between July and December, July last year and December this year, as part of the GMCA's 3-year Skills for Growth programme, which is funded through European Social Fund. And it really is aiming to plug those skills gaps. So in terms of what kind of really has enabled that policy to work, so retrofit is an absolute priority issue for Greater Manchester. Most of the city's emissions come from buildings. And they've been able to act because of those greater powers that they have through their devolution deal. And also they have huge amounts of political support from Andy Burnham. It's something he mentioned in his manifesto in 2019, and he's very kind of hands-on in making sure that this gets delivered. And I think the other key is really working in partnership, so working with different colleges, working with the university and private suppliers as well. In terms of if you can move to the next slide, please. In terms of lessons for other councils, I think the way that Greater Manchester have engaged with the local industry, showing that the demand is there, really showing what careers can be there. And those are both kind of on the tools and off the tools in terms of the retrofit workforce, and that these jobs can actually pay quite substantially. There's probably more scope to link to procurement. So clearly there is money going into councils through various government schemes such as Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and to actually link those people being trained directly through procurement in the way that Denise talked about in relation to the Passive House project. There is scope for doing more of that in Greater Manchester, and I've just got a quote there around the importance of skills from an officer at GMCA. And I think that's my final slide. So back to you, Emma.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Cara. So lots of fantastic opportunities there. As someone's mentioned in the chat, there are all sorts of different things that local authorities can do to move this area forward, and hopefully just a few inspiring examples there. So we've got quite a few questions that have been put into the Q&A function. Do feel free to add any. We've got 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so to pick the brains of my colleagues and Denise. So if we could also have Sandra and Frida turn their cameras on, they're going to be part of the panel as well. So our first question is, well, it's always the question that comes up around Passive House, and you did address it briefly, Denise, but could you tell us a little bit more about the cost, so the additional cost of building Passive House versus standard sort of minimum standards, and really how you balance the Passive House benefits with the need for affordability?
Yes, okay. So, I mean, estimates of how much more it costs can vary, but it's usually said to be between 5 to 10%, perhaps sometimes a bit more, depending on how you do it, but around 5 to 10% that it adds on. So I suppose partly the way we are then tackling that is that our model is to supplement through market sales, and I suppose we're quite lucky in York in some ways, but it's also a huge challenge for us is that we have quite a high cost housing market, so that's a big challenge in terms of affordability for people in the city, but it does mean that all our assessments indicate that we can make that balance. As I said, we do have Homes England funding. We've had some initial brownfield site funding, but then we've also secured more funding for shared ownership properties. So 40% of those first three sites will be shared ownership. So it will be 20% council housing and 40% shared ownership and 40% market sales. So taking all that together and getting grant funding where you can as well, it certainly can be done. I mean, I suppose I would say that building to this standard to tackle climate change should be a subsidised product anyway, really. That's what the government should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guessing with the soaring costs of energy, the reduced running costs of these homes mean that extra cost will be offset that much more quickly, and I would hope we see a much bigger demand from the market for homes like this. Suddenly people are going to be much more interested in homes that don't cost much to run. Sandra or Cara, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add to that. Cara, I know you've done quite a lot of work with Passive House Trust, etc., in terms of costs, etc. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think it's the 5 to 10% figure is the one that I've heard. I think probably the more you do it, the more you get your construction teams familiar with it, then those costs are going to come down. But yeah, around 5 to 10%.
Super, thanks. Sandra?
Yeah, so I just thought it might be interesting also to just sort of chip in from the Reading case study, which obviously that was the council having a zero carbon requirement in its local plan. So it's not their own housing, but it's what they're requiring developers to meet. which I think is really interesting, because that has been, it's been through the kind of whole local plan examination process, and as part of that had to go through a viability assessment, and that assessment estimated that there would be a 1% increase in the build cost as a result of that zero carbon housing policy. So it's not a passive house standard, but it is a zero carbon standard, and the assessment included the point that the costs for buyers, because these are private owner occupied houses, the cost for buyers will go down obviously in terms of kind of lower bills, and also that actually the value of, in terms of the developers benefit, that there is quite often a high value on highly energy efficient housing. So it's quite interesting. That's all contained in that Reading case study as well.
Yeah, and we'll share a link to that case study as well in a moment. I think one of the differences probably between the Reading estimate of costs and the higher uplift of costs of Passive House is that Passive House also considers to a degree the embodied energy within construction. So it's a low energy type of construction as well as in use, whereas the Reading policy, I think I'm right in saying, Sandra, was just looking at in use energy, but that's still a big improvement over the sort of national standards. But yeah, a couple of great examples there to look at and consider. And another question, so around the practicalities of Passive House, and forgive me, Denise, if you mentioned this already while I was checking on the questions, gas connections, are these homes connected to gas? And how is hot water and boost heating provided if they're not?
No, they're not connected to gas. They're the roofs are all absolutely loaded with solar PV, which is part of the design that Mikhail Richards have done, and they do have air source heat pumps, and I think there's a bit in the detail of the our case study on your website that discusses the sort of sourcing air source heat pumps that are very small, because that's all you need, because the thermal efficiency is so great. But obviously you need to heat the water as well. So because the thermal efficiency is so great, small heat pumps and solar PV covers it really.
Yeah, fantastic.
And we certainly don't want to build any new houses with connection to the gas grid.
No, absolutely not. And I know others have said that that's been a challenge when it comes to marketing properties, that it's difficult to persuade people to buy a home without gas. Again, I would hope that's changing. I mean, that's going to be brought in by legislation anyway. Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Another question around the use of CIL, so community infrastructure levies for green infrastructure, and whether this has been formalised by legislation. I'm just going to read the rest of this out. I've heard some cities or boroughs are enforcing developers to pay a green levy based on the performance of buildings, domestic or commercial. So lower standards would have to pay a higher levy to offset their operational carbon performance. That sounds a bit like the carbon offset funds that are being used in London. Cara, do you want to say something about those?
I'll say a bit, but I'm going to hand over to Sandra on the assumption she knows a bit more about CIL than I do, actually. But certainly what I do know about is the carbon offsetting that is being used and has been used quite widely in London for a while now, and particularly the inner London boroughs that have a lot of development going on, such as Islington and Camden, have raised quite substantial amounts of money through the carbon offset funds, which has funded things like solar, renewable projects, energy efficiency, and all sorts. So that has been used quite effectively. And what they're starting to do now is to ramp up that per tonne carbon offset price, so that developers are having to, well, either meet the standards, so it's a big incentive for actually meeting the standards, or more money comes into the council. But in terms of the CIL point specifically, Sandra, are you able to address that?
I would have to look into that. Actually, I'm not aware of how that CIL is being used specifically in that way. I was probably just going to say, kind of similar examples to you, Cara. Again, kind of the Reading example, any developers that can't meet the standard do have to pay into offset scheme, which is directly used for energy efficiency or renewable energy. So it's not kind of a, plant a few trees type of offset scheme, is kind of put into directly relevant measures, but obviously the kind of the preferred scenario is that all developers are meeting the standard rather than offsetting.
And Frida, I can't remember if the SIL case study was one of yours. Is there anything you want to add on that? And I think if we can share a link to the case study that talks about the use of SIL, which will have a bit more detail.
I will stick that in the chat. I don't think it was one of.
Right, perfect. And Denise, I don't know if there's anything you want to say from
Well,
your experience of SILs.
Well, we don't use SIL yet because we haven't got a local plan through, which is a bit of a touchy subject, but we did have some presentations on it. But yeah, I don't want to hold us up, but I'm not sure exactly what to add.
Yeah, take a look at the South Gloucestershire case study, which talks about how much money they've raised through community infrastructure levies. And Dan, it's fascinating to hear that in Devon, the council is building passive house social housing, but is fitting them with gas boilers, as you say, in sunny Devon with no solar. Denise, I don't know if you'd be happy to share your contact details. Perhaps Dan could put some of his councillors in touch with you and you could persuade them that they really shouldn't be putting gas onto those boilers. So we'll try and put you in touch, Dan, after this event. And then a couple of other questions. So, well, not a question, more of a comment. So again, Sam has raised the Energiesprong example, which is actually about retrofitting homes to a very, very high standard, and thinks they've done it on a 4% margin. We didn't cover, did we cover Energiesprong in the case studies? I know we've got other case studies on Energiesprong, so we can share some details on that development as well. It's about doing sort of whole house retrofit and bringing old homes basically up to very close to zero carbon standards. So if you haven't come across that, we'll share some details on that. And then I think just another sort of a comment, but also a question about I really liked as well, those intergenerational living examples. I know that's something that with old housing, it's incredibly difficult to manage the logistics of trying to look after elderly relatives, you know, nearby. There just isn't the sort of suitable housing stock. So is that, has there been any, are those houses occupied now? Has anyone looked at sort of how that's working? Is that successful in helping encourage families to look after elderly relatives, for example?
No, they're not occupied yet. We don't have any of those on the Lowfield sites, so the new sites not yet. But I think we anticipate a lot of interest, and there's been quite a lot of work done in the community engagement part of the process. You know, there are people. We know there are people looking for sort of intergenerational community-led developments, which they can't necessarily get off the ground, but we know there's a lot of interest in that, and it will enable people to have, they're like 5-bedroom houses with a connecting door that you can either close and keep it completely separate, or you can keep it open. So it could be for older people and a family, or it could be for a family with grown-up young people who want to stay in the other part of the house. And we're really trying to use that also to encourage a sense of community in our developments.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And we've had a suggestion or a request from somebody that we just explain a little bit about more about what passive house is for those that might not have come across this before. Cara, do you want to have a go at that?
I can have a go, yeah. So it's a very high standard of energy efficiency primarily for new build, but is also being used in retrofit situations as well. And it looks at the whole sort of life cycle cost of carbon. So it's also about the materials that you use, and Denise alluded to that. You using very low carbon materials, and these homes are very, very well insulated, such that in order to get the right levels of ventilation, you actually put something called mechanical ventilation, which is channeling through fresh air, because they really are super insulated. But the good side of that is that they're extremely low energy consumption. So yeah, it's really a standard about getting very low energy, really good energy efficient homes.
And one question from me, actually, probably for you, Denise. I know there was a social housing development. I think it was one of the first big social housing developments to passive house standards. And then they found, because one of the principles of passive houses, hence the passive, is to make use of the sun's heat as much as possible. but they found they were really overheating in the summer, and what they really needed was giant shade trees in front of them, which they planted, but it was going to take them 20 or 30 years to be offering any meaningful shade. Is that something that has been, I think it's something they didn't really consider when they were designing the development. So I don't know whether that's been taken into consideration, or any comments on how to mitigate against overheating risks.
I think we are certainly taking that into consideration, because the last week has just shown, the weather at the moment shows that is going to be increasingly a consideration that will impact on social services and in all kinds of ways. We've had people having to deal with excess heat anyway from climate change. So my understanding is that sorry, excuse me, that by carefully considering, you know, the design, the orientation in the first place, and then the combination of the air source heat pump can, in my technical skills falling down here, I think the air source heat pump can be switched to cooling, or if not, the mechanical ventilation can. Yeah, somebody help me, I'm getting slightly mixed up there. Between the two of them, you can certainly provide for cooling, and there are other ways of, you can open all the windows at night if it does build up any heat inside, because your thermal insulation is good. Once it's cool, it will stay cool, is my understanding. I can come back and tell you a bit more about this soon, because my house is being done as we speak, so I will be more authoritative on that. But it certainly can be taken into account, and it can be resolved, and we do need to look at it.
Can I ask Denise a question, actually? Because one of the things that came up, I was speaking to John Bootland from the Passive House Trust, and he was saying that some planning committees don't really get Passive House, and they don't get what it means in terms of orientation. They don't understand the standard. Is that an issue that you had? Did you have to go through an education process?
Yes, I think you do. Yeah. I think you do, because reaching those very high levels of thermal insulation, as we said, does cost a bit more. So people need to understand the importance of doing it, as they need to understand the importance of high standards for retrofit, that you're also seeking to reduce energy demand, and you know, there shouldn't be any new build really that this is increasing carbon emissions, and for retrofit, we should be reducing energy demand as much as possible. So I think there is an educational element to that, definitely, that needs quite a lot of attention.
Okay, and the last question, which is about whether you learnt from the co-housing movement. I think you said that part of the development was for self-build, and was part of it for co-housing?
We've got self-build on 2 of the first 3 sites. The other one's a bit too small, and they're going really well, and we're kind of supporting the self-build, you know, with a bit of a package of support, so they're not just on their own, and they are required to meet high standards of energy efficiency, very high standards. And then the co-housing, we have a co-housing project on the first site who's really driving the sustainability agenda from their own perspective. So working with them and trying to support them, and they're very much looking at using natural materials for the insulation and that kind of thing. But they have struggled with the government pulling support from those projects a while back, didn't they? It made it very difficult.
Fantastic. I can see we've actually got a participant with their hand up, Sam, who's had a fair bit to say on this topic. So we've got 1 minute left, Sam. So I'm going to allow you to talk, which I can do in a webinar. If there's something you want to chip in, the floor is yours. You just have to unmute.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks for bringing me in there. Yeah, apologies. Actually, I put my hand up a bit earlier and I didn't lower it, but I think it's been really informative and really useful. Actually, it's really good to see all the case studies. But yeah, I think covered off questions in the chat really. I was just going to mention, yeah, the overheating bit. I guess part of that, obviously, getting the orientation right of the building, if you can do that in the first instance, but I guess that's not always possible on the housing estate level. Running reversible heat pumps using solar PV and mechanical ventilation might help that. And obviously, if it's got heat recovery, but that would be more important in the winter time. But the PV bit is quite helpful, isn't it, in the summer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Offset the cooling. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Sam, and a huge thank you to Denise for her and her colleagues' help in putting together the case study and in coming to talk to us today. So that brings this session to a close. Before I finish, I just want to make a plug for our final session of the day at 4 o'clock, just in case people were thinking of shooting off. We've got a really interesting session to close today, all around the overarching lessons from these case studies. So don't miss that at 4 o'clock. But before then, we've got 2 more sessions for you. And the next one is on transport. So I'm going to hand over to Simon, who'll be chairing that session. Thank you very much.
Great.